The bone was white against the red earth, sun-bleached and time-worn, its silent presence slicing through the stillness of the outback like a scream long stifled. A farmer found it by accident, 30 kilometers from the nearest road, tangled in the roots of a fallen wattle tree. Weeks of drought had shriveled the land, coaxing secrets to the surface. This one, perhaps, the most gruesome. By nightfall, a remote stretch of bushland in Western Australia had transformed into a crime scene. For local authorities, it was a grim rediscovery. For those who had already whispered her name in mourning, it was confirmation of a fear too dark to voice out loud. The remains were later confirmed to be Ashley Langford's, the 34-year-old woman who vanished without trace nearly 9 months ago. But the question now loomed heavier than ever. How does a woman evaporate beneath the expanse of an open sky, leaving behind no trail, no scream, no sign of struggle? Ashley Langford was not the kind of woman to simply disappear. Friends remembered her laugh loud, unfiltered, clanging like wind chimes in a storm, and the way she never missed a morning run, even in the relentless heat. She was a paramedic, used to crisis, trained to stay calm amidst chaos. Her life was ritual carved into movement. Coffee at 6:15, shift by 7, home by dusk, where her dog Leo would greet her with a joy so pure it shamed the world. She lived between the sharp edges of discipline and kindness, so when she failed to show up for her niece's birthday on October 12th last year, the alarm was instant. Calls went unanswered, messages unsent. Leo was found alone and thirsty in her apartment, his leash still on its hook. The windows had been locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. It was as though Ashley had stepped into a moment and never stepped out. Detectives searched her apartment with surgical precision. Nothing was broken, nothing out of place except the unbearable absence of Ashley herself. Her favorite running shoes rested neatly by the door, untouched. A half-finished novel lay open on the armrest of her couch, a yellow highlighter pressed between pages like a breath caught mid-sentence. Her phone, wallet, and keys were all accounted for. It was as if she had been plucked from time, removed gently but entirely, without a single mark left behind. Surveillance footage from her street offered no salvation, no footage of her leaving, no unfamiliar cars, no strange faces. In a city stitched together by cameras and satellites, the vanishing seemed impossible. At first, whispers of voluntary disappearance floated through the public discourse. Depression, escape, a secret life unraveled. But her family knew better. Her mother, Eleanor, softly placing Ashley's running bibs into a shoebox, whispered through tears, she wouldn't leave Leo, not ever. And it was this visceral, maternal certainty that told investigators they were no longer searching for a missing woman, they were hunting for what had taken her. Western Australia's rugged expanse was no stranger to silence, but the days after Ashley Langford's remains were discovered, that silence thickened into something else: suspicion, dread, the heavy thrum of unanswered questions flaring across the hot horizon. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, combing the surrounding bushland for signs that nature might have preserved a story humanity had overlooked. Her bones told little, weather-worn, fragmented. Their positioning suggested no immediate cause of death, only the rough passing of time. But far stranger were the items discovered within a narrow perimeter near the wattle tree. A tattered strip of fabric resembling her work uniform, half buried beneath dust, and a tarnished chain bracelet her sister swore she never took off. Yet, what investigators couldn't explain was the utter absence of surrounding footprints, drag marks, or wildlife disturbance. It was as though she had been spirited there, gently placed and left hidden beneath the earth, not by cruelty but by something far more chilling intent. And in that grim stillness, a new theory began to form. Half-whispered among the seasoned detectives, the idea that Ashley hadn't wandered into danger. Rather, danger had waited for her, with patience. Autumn fell with a quiet vengeance. In the days following the discovery, the media swarmed like vultures circling a carcass, yet answers remained elusive. Detective Eliza Morrigan, assigned to lead the case, had seen violence in many forms, but something about this one scratched at her bones. She spent hours staring at the evidence board, At the pinned fabric scrap crusted with red soil. At the bracelet, glinting dimly beneath plastic. At maps browned with thumbprints from too many restless nights. A timeline was forming, disjointed but insistent. Ashley had worked an overtime shift at St. Vincent's Emergency the night before her disappearance, returning home around 9:30 p.m. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No screams, no arguments, no flickering lights behind drawn blinds. Her phone pinged a final signal near a cell tower 5 kilometers from her apartment, away from work, away from friends, away from any reason she should have been there. That was the last time Ashley Langford passed through the grid of the living. The final ping became a riddle that burrowed deep into Detective Morrigan's mind, looping like the ticking of a neglected clock. She drove out to the tower's coordinates herself, where the low scrubland yawned open and the cicadas screamed like guilty souls. There was nothing, no trail, no tire marks, only the deafening ache of isolation. And yet, something hollow pressed against her chest, the feeling of having arrived somewhere sacred and ruined. A rock, smeared faintly with what could have been blood, was found nearby, too dry, too old to tell. Search dogs caught scents scattered and broken, like fractured memories lost in wind, but no signs of a struggle, no voice calling from the trees. It was at this point that Morrigan circled back to an old file, long archived, another woman, gone without warning from a nearby town 3 years ago. Same age, same routine, same brutal silence in her wake. And suddenly, the question changed. Was Ashley Langford a victim of circumstance, or chapter 2 in a story no one had realized was already being written? 3 years earlier, in the wheat belt town of Kellerbarron, 35-year-old Naomi Easton had vanished, in nearly identical fashion. Like Ashley, Naomi had been a frontline worker, a nurse known for her sharp wit and unwavering empathy. She too owned a loyal companion, her cat Hudson, whom she left fed but frightened inside a locked house. Her last known activity was a quiet dinner alone after a long shift, a receipt time-stamped at 8:47 p.m. By morning, she was gone. No signs of a break-in, no financial anomalies, no history of violence or instability. Her case, cloaked in ambiguity, had been shelved, spoken of in hushed tones by old investigators who hated ghosts in open cases. But Morrigan noticed something the others hadn't, or perhaps refused to see. Both women disappeared in the weeks surrounding the change of season. Both had their last digital footprint in isolated dead zones. Both, according to those who knew them, had spent the months prior speaking of an unnamed anxiety, as though they were being watched by something not quite there. Something waiting. Detective Morrigan pulled every archived file of disappearances reported within a 5-year radius of Naomi and Ashley's last known locations. Patterns emerged like bruises beneath skin, slow to surface but impossible to ignore once seen. 4 other cases, scattered across flatlands and forgotten postcodes, shared eerie parallels. Single women aged 30 to 40, each involved in healthcare or emergency response, all vanishing without trace near seasonal thresholds. No ransom demands, no digital breadcrumbs, no ties to organized crime. They were functional, beloved, psychologically sound, until they were simply no more. She mapped them with pins and string, and a crooked constellation emerged across the landscape, as if the land itself were feeding on certain souls. But staring at the map late one night, lit only by the blue ghost of her laptop screen, Morrigan saw something else. A pattern of proximities to service roads long closed after mining operations ceased, dead zones where coverage blinked and faded like a dying breath. And that's when she remembered a name whispered in a prior investigation, tied not to the present, but to the past, a man who once worked in those very mines, dismissed under mysterious circumstances. A man who had disappeared too, only to resurface under another name. His name back then was Thomas Greaves, a diesel mechanic with a spotless record until 2012, when a fire tore through the Mount Haven site, burning away half the equipment and taking with it the life of a fellow engineer. Official reports called it an accident, a combustion of volatile gas lines, but whispers among workers suggested sabotage. Greaves left town shortly afterward, his resignation abrupt, his forwarding address false. Years later, he reappeared 2 towns over under a new name, Cameron Holt, taking short-term contracts, living in borrowed time, always near the shadows of former mines. When Detective Morrigan pulled his employment history, the folders creaked as if reluctant to divulge his wandering path. Each worksite he'd touched over the last decade mapped eerily close to the disappearance coordinates. She stared at the printouts, one by one, until a single, terrible coincidence emerged. Every woman, including Ashley, lived within driving range of Greaves in the months before she vanished. Every single one. Morrigan's breath caught, not from revelation, but from revulsion. Greaves hadn't vanished. He had been here all along, changing names, shifting skins, walking like a ghost among the vulnerable. And she knew, with mounting horror, that the truth behind Ashley's final moments wasn't buried in the bushland or sleepless streets, but in the silence of a man who once fed fire to cover his tracks. It was the predator's art, motionless, methodical, practiced. Greaves, or Holt, or whichever name he wore like a mask that season, had woven himself into invisibility. No criminal record, no fixed identity, just a residue of unease left on every place he touched. The deeper Detective Morrigan went, the more she unearthed a chilling architecture of manipulation. He took jobs that earned trust but demanded solitude, forged rental agreements that placed him near isolated service corridors, used prepaid phones that blinked off before tracking could catch their breath. He moved like smoke through cracks in a system designed to see everything, staying always 5 minutes ahead of recognition. In a stroke of agonizing irony, it was not evidence that began to break his facade, but absence, his sudden disappearance just days after Ashley's remains were found. Rent gone unpaid. Locker emptied. Phone line forever silent. It was as if he'd dissolved back into the fissures of the land, a shadow called back home. But shadows leave stains, and Morrigan, unwilling to bury another name beneath bureaucratic failure, made a promise to the bones left behind. She would find him, even if she had to burn the woods of Western Australia down to do it. In an unmarked box buried deep within the evidence vault, she found it, an old dirt-smudged photo, folded 3 times over, and nearly forgotten in Naomi Easton's archived file. It showed a group of mining personnel gathered at dusk, their faces tanned and weary, framed by the rust-red mouth of a shut-down shaft. Morrigan scanned the line of bodies until her eyes locked onto one man, just off-center, caught mid-turn. The timestamp placed it a week before the fire that ended Greaves' employment. A closer look revealed something else. In his hand, barely visible in the edge of the frame, was a chain bracelet, the same kind found near Ashley's remains. Not identical, no. Morrigan was certain it was the same. Her pulse thundered. Forensic imaging confirmed it days later. The bracelet had once belonged to Naomi Easton, gifted by her mother for graduating nursing school. Greaves hadn't just hunted these women. He had kept parts of them. Small, intimate trophies, tokens of control. She stared at the grainy printout until her vision blurred, not from tears, but fury. The country had whispered to itself about missing daughters and sealed its grief in silence, but the silence had teeth. And now, finally, it was beginning to bleed. The search shifted. No longer a passive wade through paperwork or half-hearted inquiries, but a relentless pursuit driven by the ghosts of what had been uncovered. Morrigan enlisted the support of federal analysts, going beyond state lines, beyond national databases. She began cross-referencing mining rosters, private security contracts, and job applications filed under aliases. Over months, a composite began to form of a man who had fine-tuned the habit of vanishing. Descriptions were vague: eternally approximate brown hair, average height, unremarkable eyes, but always that same impression from those who had met him briefly: quiet, polite, kept to himself. The archetype of forgettable. And yet beneath that bland exterior, something studied them all. By winter's end, police obtained DNA from Naomi's bracelet, and it matched a partial profile left behind barely noticeable on the tattered fabric near Ashley's resting place. It wasn't a full match, but enough to scream one thing in unmistakable certainty: the hunter had faltered. For the first time, he had left behind more than silence. He had left a name, if not yet in writing, then in blood, woven into the land itself. Morrigan placed a red pin on the final point of connection. She stepped back, and the map no longer looked like crime scene scatter. It looked like a route, one that snaked toward something unfinished, toward a place no one had dared to search. The cave system was marked only by a half-collapsed fence, its warning sign faded to invisibility by years of harsh sun, wind, and forgetfulness. Locals claimed it hadn't been used since the 90s, carved during exploratory digs that never yielded profit. Yet when a retired geologist came forward, spurred by news of Ashley's case and wired with the kind of guilt that ages men overnight, he confessed he'd once found a makeshift cache deep within those tunnels: empty tins, threaded wire, coarse bedding hidden behind a false wall. He never reported it. Said he thought it was the shelter of some vagrant, maybe a survivalist passing through. Detective Morrigan stood at the edge of the opening now, flashlight trembling like the beat of her own pulse. A breathless hush had taken hold. The air inside exhaled against her skin like something ancient and watching, and as her boots crossed into the dark, the question shifted once more: not just where had Ashley died, but how many lives had vanished into this silence before anyone thought to ask. The first chamber was small, its walls clawed by time, its quiet nearly unbearable. Dust danced like ghosts in the beam of Morrigan's light. Then, behind a rusted sheet of corrugated metal leaned awkwardly over a recess in the wall, Morrigan found it. A box, unlocked. Inside, fragments of lives half remembered. A cracked phone screen still stained with fingerprints. A necklace with a broken clasp. A faded photograph of a woman Morrigan did not recognize. And a journal, water-damaged yet legible, its first entry dated 6 years ago. The entries were not confessions, they were accounts. Observations. Notes on routines, vulnerabilities, and choices. The women had names. The entries labeled them by numbers. Subject 4 prefers evening walks after shifts. Keeps keys between fingers. Watches shadows. Morrigan collapsed to her knees, the weight of the pages pressing against her throat like a scream unspoken. They had been studied, hunted methodically, and yet in the final entry, the handwriting had changed. It was shakier, panicked. The final line read, "They know. I waited too long." Behind her, something creaked. Not metal, not rock, something breathing. Morrigan spun toward the sound, weapon drawn, every nerve in her body aflame. But the tunnel behind her remained still, cloaked only in the suffocating dark. She forced herself to breathe, the journal pressed tightly to her chest, as if to shield her from the horror it contained. There was no pursuit, only the echo of her own fear ricocheting through the stone hollow. Yet that breath, the one she swore she heard, clung to the air like spilled oil. She knew then that the cave had not been abandoned. Someone had been here, perhaps still was, slipping deeper into the labyrinth or waiting for night to fall. Back above ground, daylight brought no comfort. The discovery was undeniable. The journal could not be unseen. It was evidence not just of obsession but of design. A predator who had disappeared not because he was running, but because he had retreated to the burrow from which he first emerged. Morrigan stood at the threshold once more, blinking against the burn of truth. For now, the darkness had retreated. But it had not gone. And somewhere, in the redemptive silence of the desert, the land whispered of more bones yet to be found. Late that evening, as Morrigan sat at her kitchen table with the journal splayed before her like a wound, she traced the entries with fingers that refused to stop trembling. Each line felt like a verdict handed down from silence itself. Subject 1. Subject 2. Until she reached Subject 6, Ashley Langford. The notes were sparse, clinical, predictable, loyal to the dog. Evening jogs consistent. No suspecting behavior. Then, a jotted line. Disconnected from the rest. Beautiful scream. Almost didn't hear it. Morrigan shut the book. Her face was blank, but her jaw had hardened into stone. This wasn't the work of someone driven solely by rage or impulse. It was a collector's compulsion, a desecration of fate by someone who believed he had the right to choose who stayed and who was devoured by absence. The case files, the bones, the empty houses, the silence, all of it had been woven into a single dark chorus. But now, finally, it had a name. A whisper turned roar, and the hunt was no longer theoretical. Somewhere out there, the man called Greaves was breathing air laced with the same dust that had buried his victims, and Detective Morrigan was coming for him not as an agent of law, but as a reckoning he could never outrun. 2 weeks later, silence broke like a fever across the edges of New Norcia, a monastery town nestled in ochre hills and brittle eucalyptus. A tip had come through, anonymous, scratchy, likely placed from a burner phone now turned to ash. It named a property just beyond the town's limits, once used by itinerant workers, now left idle and half-swallowed by saltbush. Morrigan arrived at dawn, backed by a tactical response unit, and the cold fire of justification blazing beneath her ribs. They approached slowly, boots crunching sandstone, hearts thudding in grim unison. The house sagged sideways like it had grown tired of keeping secrets. But inside, past the rust-holed stove, down into a storm cellar reeking of rust and sick-sweet rot, the final truth unfurled. Scattered across concrete were rows of vials, hair samples, worn clothing, tagged with years. A wall bore newspaper clippings, one for each woman. Each face circled like prey. In a corner, shivering and muttering to himself, face half covered with soot and beard and terror, was Greaves. He did not fight. He did not speak. He simply looked up at Morrigan with eyes void of astonishment, as if he'd always known the past would catch him. Morrigan didn't feel triumph. She felt gravity, the weight of names carved invisibly into the air, now reclaimed. And in that strangled space of finality, she realized the question had never been how Ashley vanished. It was why no one had listened sooner, when silence first began screaming. For weeks following Greaves' arrest, the nation sat transfixed, straining to make sense of the unthinkable. The media called him the Phantom of the Pilbara, spinning tales that danced between horror and disbelief. But beneath the headlines and breathless coverage, families gathered in quiet rooms, clutching pictures and memories now charged with new, terrible clarity. Memorials bloomed along hiking trails, near floodlights and forests, beneath gum trees where names echoed in wind like unanswered prayers. Ashley Langford was finally laid to rest, the service quiet, steeped in sunlight and silence. Leo, her dog, sat beside Eleanor throughout, his loyal eyes fixed on the empty space beside the casket. There was no real victory here, only the fragile ritual of remembering and the conviction that monsters cannot live forever in the cracks. And as Detective Morrigan stood at the back, her hands clenched in grieving, she repeated a vow she would carry like a stone in her throat. Never again would the desert bury its daughters in silence. Never again would stillness be mistaken for safety. Still, the scars lingered, not all of them visible. In the aftermath, Western Australia bore a quiet tension, like the breath held before another storm. Communities built shrines from driftwood and dried flowers, roadside tributes marking where fear had once bloomed unnoticed. Mental health services reported an uptick in trauma-related calls from women in regional towns, a collective unraveling of the illusion of safety. But others found strength in the darkness, not defiance born of anger, but resilience folded into sorrow like seeds pressed into soil. A foundation in Ashley's name was established, dedicated to missing persons cases in rural territories, ensuring that no disappearance would fall like dead leaves behind the noise again. Detective Morrigan, now a household name to some and a quiet warrior to others, refused press interviews. She returned to work, quieter, sharper, and when asked why she kept going, simply said, "Because silence remembers who listens." The land, once a mute witness, now hummed with names. Names that would never be forgotten, because finally, the silence was not just broken. It was heard. Years later, when the air had softened and time had worn the sharpness from the grief, tourists passing through the outback would sometimes pause at a peculiar sight, a lone wattle tree standing solemnly beside a polished sandstone plaque. Beneath it, names were etched, not just Ashley's, but Naomi's, and those once forgotten now known. Locals called it the Whispering Place, not out of myth, but reverence. Survivors came bearing letters, small objects, tokens of remembrance folded in trembling hands. Among them, once each year, came Eleanor, now silver-haired, Leo at her side, their quiet footsteps part of an unspoken ritual. Across the horizon, the red earth breathed beneath them. Somewhere, not far from that place, Morrigan patrolled in silence, her eyes still searching not for danger, but for the cracks that silence once slipped through. She had become the keeper of echoes, the guardian of unscreamed truths. And in that vast, unforgiving expanse where stories can die unheard, Ashley Langford's story endured, not in headlines but in hearts, calling out with every gust of wind through eucalyptus leaves. I was here, and I mattered. They say the land never truly forgets. And in the rust-red soils of Western Australia, where silence once swallowed screams and shadows hid the unthinkable, something changed. The wind still howled through ghost towns, and the cicadas still sang their mournful dirges at dusk, but there was no longer ignorance in the quiet. There was memory. There was reckoning. Ashley Langford's story became more than a tragedy. It became a warning carved into the soul of the country. And though monsters like Greaves may wear the face of the ordinary and walk unnoticed through the margins, they can no longer count on the world to stay blind. In the end, it was not vengeance that brought justice. It was love, a mother's unshakable truth, a detective's refusal to surrender to silence, a dog guarding a doorway no longer waiting. And somewhere, beneath the endless sky Ashley once ran beneath, something shifted. The land listened. The silence cracked. And those who had vanished became more than names. They became a legacy that refused to disappear. Even now, long after headlines have faded and news vans have passed on to fresher tragedies, the legacy of Ashley Langford and the justice clawed from dirt and silence remains etched into the backbone of the nation. Schools built curriculums around her story, teaching students not just how to speak, but how to hear the tremble in a voice, the absence in a routine, the unease that so often signals danger cloaked in normalcy. Lawmakers rewrote policies, mandating better tracking of rural disappearances, faster cross-state collaboration, more persistent pursuit of what once slipped through the cracks. But most of all, her name became a kind of prayer whispered in the dark by those who still felt alone, a reminder that to vanish is not to be forgotten, that to be hunted is not to be erased. And just as the red earth once yielded its secrets beneath the weight of drought and grief, so too did it learn to pulse with memory, because some lives do not fade. They echo, and some stories, like hers, outlive the silence that tried to contain them. And somewhere deep in the marrow of the continent, where time folds like heat over the plains and ghost stories curve with the wind, a quiet revolution endures, one not forged in fury, but in remembrance. Ashley Langford became more than a woman lost to cruelty. She became the axis upon which silence turned to voice, upon which vanished stories insisted on being found. There is power in that. In the echo of her name, passed hand to hand like a sacred ember, in every missing person's bulletin that no longer waits to grow cold. In every tired detective, now willing to see the pattern, where once they saw only chance, justice does not come clean. It crawls, burdens the living, redraws the map of a nation with scars that teach, but it came for Ashley, for Naomi, for all the voices that refuse to go gently. And as long as the wind sings through those rusted fences and the wattle trees reach toward the endless sky, the land will remember. So must we. Somewhere beneath a sky wide enough to carry every funeral silence and every unsung name, the wind carries a different kind of story now. It is not only grief that drifts through the pale branches of Western Australia's bushland, but resolve woven into the land like veins in stone. For every girl who once felt a shadow trailing too close, for every mother still clutching hope like a fragile photograph, Ashley Langford's name beats like a drum. Steady, defiant, unforgettable. Her end was not the end. It was the fault line that shook the silence into memory, that forged mourning into a movement. And while the world may spin forward, faster and louder, oblivious and consuming, there will always be places that remember. A trailhead marked by a single white bone, a journal locked in evidence, a wattle tree rooted in defiance, echoes for those who listen, warnings for those who dare forget, because in the hush between tragedies, in the soft places where stories wait to be noticed, the land now answers back. And so, in the years that follow, as the sun continues to crawl across the scorched plains and time lays its gentle dust across old wounds, the outback hums with a quiet vigilance. Beneath its vast silence lives a story that refuses to sleep, a story etched in the creases of grief and the fierce outlines of justice kindled too late. Ashley Langford became more than memory, more than lost potential and unanswered calls. She became the beginning of a world that would no longer flinch from sorrow, no longer turn from the subtle signs of vanishing. Her name is now stitched into training manuals, saluted in candlelit vigils, carved into the soul of a nation that once looked away. And deep in the eucalyptus-shadowed air, where the cry of cicadas still stitches noon with ache, there is a new sound, faint but persistent. Footsteps not retreating, but advancing. Those who listen carefully can hear them. The keepers of the voices once stolen, their promise walking steady through the silence we heard. We remember. We will not let it happen again. In time, the land grew quieter again, but never quite the same. Trails once walked in solitude now carried breath shared between strangers, words exchanged with caution and care, as if the soil itself might whisper back. Travelers left offerings not of superstition, but solidarity. Bracelets tied to branches, stones painted with initials and dates, flowers tucked gently into bark crevices. Each one a vow, a marker of the human need not just to survive, but to remember. And at dusk, when the sun bled its final warmth across the spine of the outback, and shadows stretched long and searching, that remembering took new form, a chorus unspoken, but fiercely felt. Because justice, like mourning, is never complete. It is passed on like flame between hands, lit anew in each act of listening. The story of Ashley Langford still lived, not just in archives or memory, but in the hearts taught to recognize the shape of silence. And for every voice that once vanished into the wind unnoticed, there now stood 1,000 echoing back, I see you, I hear you. I will not let you be forgotten. So as the years stretch forward, under skies as wide and unwritten as ever, there stands an invisible thread that binds the living to the lost. It winds through eucalyptus groves, through candlelit vigils and police case rooms, through Eleanor's quiet prayers and Morrigan's tireless resolve. It threads through each headline etched too late, and each whisper spoken too soon, pulling memory through time like a lifeline. That thread, fragile, luminous, unbreakable, is the legacy of Ashley Langford. A name that began as a question, sharpened into a cry, and settled at last into a vow. Her story, once buried beneath dust and disregard, now guards the silence she once vanished into. And as long as someone keeps speaking her name, as long as one listener still hears the echo of the vanishing and dares to follow it, then the promise she left behind will hold. No daughter of this land will ever be forgotten again. Not in silence, not in shadow, not ever. One final image endures in the collective mind, a photo, framed in weathered timber, resting on the altar of the whispering place. In it, Ashley stands beneath a sky so achingly wide it seems it might swallow her, but she smiles as though she owns the world. That smile, no longer just a memory but a legacy, watches over every woman who dares to live freely in a land that once swallowed them whole. It reminds those who pass by, there is no such thing as a quiet disappearance. There is only a story waiting for someone to listen hard enough, to dig deep enough, to refuse silence long enough for truth to bloom. And in that blooming, in that sacred act of bearing witness, Ashley lives not in the terror of her vanishing, but in the defiant echo of her being found. So now, her name is spoken not just in grief, but with reverence in policy rooms where change takes root, in classrooms where vigilance is born, in bedrooms where mothers press the stories into the ears of daughters curled up close. Ashley Langford. A name that cracked centuries of silence, that gave the voiceless a language steeped not in fear, but in fire. It is not the tragedy alone that endures, but the light dragged through the darkness by those who refused to let her be another unsolved breath, another fading photograph. In the end, her story was never about how she vanished. It was about how she was seen, truly seen in her absence. And through her, so many others are finally being seen too. For in the wide, ancient stillness of a land that once swallowed screams and blurred their echoes into wind, there now stands a roar stitched by memory, guarded by truth, and willed into permanence by love. Ashley lives there, and she always will. And so the Red Earth, once complicit in erasing footsteps and swallowing screams, now holds an oath, not just carved into plaques or held in the lines of legislation, but carried in the breath of those who remember. Somewhere in the trembling silence between nightfall and dawn, between heartbreak and hope, a story endures not of vanishing, but of rising. Ashley Langford's legacy does not rest in the tragedy of her disappearance, but in the fierce insistence of her return, in the way her name has rewritten what it means to be heard. Her story is no longer a cautionary tale whispered across fences. It is a call to vigilance, a prayer answered not by justice alone, but by every heart that refuses to let another woman slip into shadow unseen. Beneath that vast, merciless sky, in a country learning to listen at last, Ashley remains a beacon against forgetting, a warrior in stillness, a promise breathlessly kept. And perhaps that is the truest mark of her legacy, that even now, long after the burying is done and the breathless headlines have dulled into static, the silence that once masked her disappearance has transformed into a vigil, not merely a monument nor a memory, but a living, breathing vigilance that hums in the soil, resonates through corridors of power, and echoes in every determined step taken by those still following her trail. In the end, Ashley Langford did not vanish. She shattered the illusion of disappearance. She left behind not just bones in the red dirt, but a map etched in grief and fire, a map others now follow so that no scream will go unanswered, no silence go unchallenged. Her name has become the rallying cry of a continent learning, finally, to hear. The desert speaks. The wind remembers. And across the rusted heart of a land once deaf to its own sorrow, the vow carries on etched in sky, in soil, in soul. Never again unspoken. Never again unseen. And so the story closes not with an ending, but with a breath, the kind that carries weight and warmth, as if the land itself sighs in relief. Ashley Langford's name, once whispered only in fear and sorrow, now pulses across the country like a drumbeat, slow and strong. Her face watches over vigils. Her legacy pulses in reforms. Her absence carves space that others now fill with voices and action. Her vanishing, once an unsolvable void, became a spark that pulled a nation's grief into focus, into fury, into forward motion. And long after the flashbulbs have dimmed, after justice has been served and systems reshaped, she walks still in memory, yes, but also in impact, in every girl who now runs freely, without fear, beneath an ever-watching sky. This is not just the story of how she vanished, it is the story of how we changed because she was lost. And in that, Ashley Langford is forever found. In the end, it is not the brutality of Ashley Langford's vanishing that defines her remembrance, nor the meticulous hunt that followed, but the tenderness with which a nation refused to let her go. Her story became the marrow in the bones of justice, the hush before every woman's name is spoken with urgency and care. And as the red sun falls each day over the vast wilderness that once held her in silence, something beautiful now stirs in its place, a chorus of remembrance, soft but relentless, The land watches differently now. The people listen differently. There is no erasing of what was lost, but there is a promise that holds. For Ashley, for Naomi, for every soul once taken by the dark without warning. The story ends here not with silence, but with legacy, etched in the wattle's breath, painted into dusk, whispered in wind. You were seen. You were found. You are remembered. And somewhere quiet, between the murmurs of wind brushing over skeletal trees and the slow exhale of dusk settling over red eucalypt soil, Ashley Langford's story lingers not as a cautionary tale, not as the sum of a single crime, but as a testament to the power of being remembered, because in the end, what strips evil of its deepest victory is not justice in a courtroom or headlines on a page, but the refusal to forget, the insistence that a vanished life is still worth speaking of, long after the world has moved on. Ashley did not vanish alone. She rose again in truth-tellers, in searchers, in mothers who will not bow their heads, in daughters taught that silence hides not safety but danger. The land no longer swallows, it sings. And above its endless, rust-streaked horizon, where memory and mourning fold into one, Ashley runs still not as a shadow lost, but as a light that found its way through. So let her story remain not in amber, frozen and untouchable, but as wind and fire and breath passed from soul to soul. Let it echo in the footsteps of those who walk old trails with new eyes, in the whispered prayers of those still searching for names lost to the shadows. Let it live in every refusal to be silent, in every demand for answers not yet given. Ashley Langford's journey began in silence. Yes, but it did not end there. It became a chorus of reckoning, a map of mourning turned to movement, a promise that every life vanishing into the vastness of this wild, watching land will be traced and treasured until it is brought home. The outback holds no more illusions of forgetting. It cradles her name now forever, as the wind carries her forward, not vanished, not silenced, but shining. The story is done. The remembering is not. And perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, not immortality, but remembrance. A name thick with weight and worn with love. Ashley Langford's tale, once scattered across the silence like broken glass, has become something whole, something radiant, a story that walks with the living, speaks through policy and prayer, whispers from the mouths of mothers and flickers in the tears of strangers. Her footprints, once erased by time and neglect, now blaze across the sands as testament, not as a warning, not only as grief but as triumph, as guardianship. And in every sigh of wind that rakes over the bush, in every silent vigil where candles dare the night, she answers still not with words, but with presence. I was here. I remain. Let her name echo once more, not as a footnote to horror, but as a line etched into the conscience of a country reclaiming its vigilance. Let Ashley Langford be whispered in storms and steadied in sunrises, a constant reminder that behind each name lost is a universe imploded, and behind each name remembered, a world reborn. Across dry riverbeds and listening trees, her presence weaves itself into the marrow of future stories, those that will not vanish without pursuit, those who will speak before the silence deepens. And when the last page turns, when the final watcher sets down the journal of truths painfully collected, may we understand that hers was not just a tragedy, but a tide turned. Ashley Langford, once a headline, now a heartbeat. May her memory be a compass for those still searching, and a lantern for those left behind. Not forgotten, never bowed, forever found. And in the hush that follows, where even the wind holds its breath and history folds gently into memory, the final truth emerges. Ashley Langford did not simply vanish, she transformed. From absence into awareness, from tragedy into testament. Her story, once a flicker lost in the expanse, now burns unfaltering through policy, through memory, through every tear-shaped tribute left beneath a wattle tree kissed by sun and sorrow. She walks in the footsteps of every woman shielded by the light her legacy ignited. She lingers in the reckoning of every silence finally heard. In the great ledger of the land where names once disappeared without trace, hers has become the signature that ended forgetting. And so, as the red earth breathes, and the cicadas sing and the people remember, Ashley remains not just in the soil that once held her still, but in the unrelenting movement of a world that finally chose to listen. So let it be inscribed across time itself that she was never reduced to a case file or a clue, never just a whisper lost in the tyranny of space and silence. Ashley Langford's memory now anchors a future more vigilant, more compassionate, more unafraid to face the shadows. In the end, the red earth could not keep her buried, the silence could not keep her erased, and forgetting could not claim her. Instead, she remains like stone warmed by morning sun, enduring, luminous, present. As the horizon draws its aching line across Australia's vastness, as new names are written into the chronicles of empathy and awareness, one truth will always hold loudest, clearest, most unyielding. She mattered. She was loved. And she will never fade again. And so we leave her story not behind, but within us, carried like breath in the deepest part of the chest, like quiet defiance stitched into the marrow of a listening land. Ashley Langford did not choose to vanish, but the world chose to find her, to speak her name when silence beckoned, to follow her shape through darkness until light bled through. Her footprints now anchor every step forward. Her echo steadies every wavering voice. And her legacy, tender yet unbreakable, walks ahead of us, still guiding, warning, loving. Because in a world that once let her slip unseen, Ashley is now the sentinel at the gate. The story has ended, but the remembering, woven now into us all, goes on. For the land does not simply tell stories, it holds them, breathes them back into those willing to listen, to remember, to carry forward what was almost lost. Beneath the wattle branches, and over the wind-worn trails marked by grief, Ashley Langford's legacy endures not as a statue cast in stone or a date etched in mourning, but as a living vow encoded into the conscience of a nation. She became not just the woman who disappeared, but the reason we learned how to see, how to ask, how to never again let silence win. And in that truth, born from sorrow and lit by unrelenting love, her story never truly ends. It walks beside us, a light on the hill, a presence in the dusk, a chorus rising through the red soil's breath. I am here. I endured. And you will never forget me.